This is Stigma, where we talk with leaders from many industries about how mental health and addiction have impacted their lives. Many people suffer silently from mental illness, addiction, depression, anxiety, and trauma. They never seek help because of stigma. In this podcast, host Stephen Hayes and his guests share their stories of recovery in order to encourage others to do the same. Here's Stephen.
Welcome back to the Stigma Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Hayes, and today's guest is Doug Drysdale. He's the CEO of Cybin, which is a psychedelic business developing technologies and delivery systems aimed at improving bioavailability to achieve the desired effects of psychedelics at low dosage levels. Doug is an extremely accomplished and experienced CEO who has chaired a NASDAQ-listed company. He's built and turned around 3 different pharmaceutical companies over the last 12 years. He's got more than 30 years of experience in the healthcare sector broadly, and he brings a really incredible level of expertise to the psychedelic space that is truly amazing. In our broad-ranging conversation, we talk at length about the psychedelic space and how the recent elections impact the industry, the seeming frenzy of psychedelic drug developers raising money to pursue novel compounds and go public, and where all of that leads us in the coming years. But before we dive in, there's one thing I want to remind the founders and our audience of. What If Ventures recently launched the first cohort of our What If Fellowship program. The fellowship is an 8-week accelerator designed to help mental health and addiction-focused entrepreneurs accelerate the growth of their businesses in the mental health space. We are wrapping up our first cohort now, and we'll be starting our next cohort soon. You can learn more via a link in the show notes. But without any further delay, let's get into it. Doug, thank you so much for being here, man. I've been really excited about having this conversation with you.
It's great to be on, Stephen. It's good to be speaking with you today.
So I'd love to have you start by sharing a little bit of your story, kind of bio and background, and what you've been up to in your career in the pharmaceutical space and how you found your way to the psychedelic industry.
Okay, about 30 years in healthcare, so I'll try and keep it succinct. Yeah, I spent a lot of my early career in business development and M&A, and the last dozen years or so being the CEO of 3 different pharmaceutical companies. One was a startup that we took from inception to almost $500 million of revenues in about 5 years in 35 countries. And the other 2 were turnaround situations. One was a public company on the NASDAQ. We turned into a specialty pharma company selling CNS and pain products. And the other was a CDMO that essentially where other pharma companies brought us their molecules and we turned them into products and turned that around and got the business onto the Inc. 5000 list last year. My motivation around mental health started much, much earlier in my career. When I first left high school, I worked in a lab, a biochemistry lab in a hospital. And I would be in the lab in the middle of the night and you'd have all these ER admissions that I would be testing. And the bulk of those by far were teenage suicide attempts and drug overdoses. So, depression and addiction. Then through my life, really, I had a personal connection to many family and friends that have also suffered from depression and addiction. So, any opportunity to help in this space is easy to be motivated by. I signed on to Cybin during the whole COVID pandemic. So at a time when mental health issues have really been elevated and awareness has been increased, it really just seemed like the right time to get involved and help out and do something. And this is a space with lots of opportunities for innovation and growth.
Yeah, I agree. And I think one of the things for me that excites me about this space is that we get to talk about words like cure and not just mitigate or make it a little bit better. We get to talk about cure or long-term benefits. These drugs are going to be really, really powerful for the mental health space. And I think people are starting to wake up to that. And this market is, like you said, there's just so much white space here.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, it's completely transformative. You go back and look at the history of treating, say, depression, and the SSRIs really just treat the signs and symptoms of disease and not the underlying causes. And that's where psychedelics really have the opportunity to be transformative and address those underlying causes of the disease.
It seems like this market's really evolving. It's really kind of coming into its own recently. Is that good? Is it bad? Is it too much too fast? I mean, it seems to me like there's a lot of companies raising these pre-public financings and then going through RTOs and becoming public. Is it too much too fast? Is it kind of like the cannabis space, or is this more sustainable, you think?
Look, I think it seems to be happening quickly, but this is really 50 years in the making, right? So it's not like it's happened overnight. I do think that the pandemic that we're in has raised awareness of mental health, and it's made it easier for people to talk about their mental health issues. The stigma has kind of been partially, at least, washed away. And I'm not really surprised that companies are deciding to take the public route, just like Cybin, because drug development is very expensive. You've really got to be public in order to raise the kind of capital you need to bring a drug to market over several years of clinical studies. And I think this is the right way to go. I think science leading the way is the right way to go. Your point about rushing is good, though. I mean, we do have to kind of tread with caution. I do think the regulatory pharmaceutical pathway is the sensible way to go. I mean, when you look back at the history of these molecules, we've already had a backlash once. I'd love to sort of avoid that happening again. So while I would personally, not Cybin, me personally support decriminalizing nature, I think we also have to tread carefully and administer these treatments in controlled situations. So we minimize those bad effects, right? The bad experiences, because what we don't want to do is have a backlash and inhibit access to these treatments for so many people that need them.
Yeah, what do you think that the election means for the psychedelic space? And I'm not talking about who won the White House in the U.S. and that kind of thing, but the overwhelming support for decriminalization, it seems to be nationwide in the U.S. I think it's a huge indicator for the psychedelic space.
It is, and I think it's a culmination of so many things. I think that is about people in this pandemic taking back control, right, and not being told what they can and can't do and put in their bodies. I also think it's finally a backlash from the whole war on drugs that really failed, right? I mean, not to get too political here, but the US has 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's prisoners, and the vast majority of those are in there for nonviolent drug crime, which just seems absurd. So I think it's all a part of people taking control, and we're really encouraged by these initiatives like Initiative 81 in DC decriminalizes certain psychedelics, and Measure 109 in Oregon, we're big supporters of. We love the way that they've put together thoughtfully, this mental health framework that will hopefully open up a pathway for controlled clinical studies and collecting data in a safe way. And hopefully Oregon becomes a pilot for the rest of the country. That'd be great to see.
Well, I think that's the case. And I think it is. I think it will. I think, there was some research that came out just in the last week from Johns Hopkins, the clinical trial they did on major depressive disorders and the use of psilocybin to treat them and the effectiveness. And it's just mind-boggling how much more effective these drugs are than the SSRIs that have dominated this market for decades.
Yeah, it's great to see the MDD program, a study out of Johns Hopkins. I mean, some of these studies in the past have been done in treatment-resistant depression and more severe patients. So good to see data in major depressive disorder. Yeah, look, these drugs work in a very different way. They create a period of temporary neuroplasticity, opening up new networks and connections that help the brain help itself. Help the patient help themselves by reflecting on the underlying causes of their depression or their anxiety, rather than just stressing the signs and symptoms. That has pros and cons. I think the positive is that you end up with this, fundamental shift in mindset and enabling the patient to address their disorder. But it means that some of these sessions can be quite traumatic, right? I mean, 6 to 8 hours of almost wallowing in your own causes of your depression, it can be traumatic for some people. But that also means that they're very powerful. So again, I go back to, I think that these treatments have tremendous hope for helping a lot of people. We just have to do it in the right way, in a kind of controlled environment.
So a question I have a little bit more about Cybin itself. How does the average person eventually end up interacting with your company? Where do you guys touch the consumer or the patient in their journey, in their life cycle of seeking psychedelic-assisted treatment?
So let me tell you a bit about where we are. So we've recently finished a private placement, a $45 million round, a go public round. In fact, the largest go public round in the space in Canadian history. So we're very happy.
Yeah, it was quite incredible. Congratulations.
Thanks. Very happy about that. But not just the amount that we raised. 90 to 95% of the investors in that round were US blue chip biotech funds. And I think that's a real shift. When you start to get those kind of funds investing in this space, it kind of gives it legitimacy. And so we're very honored to have those folks in there. We completed our reverse takeover yesterday into a public shell, and we plan to list on the NEO exchange. We've been approved to list around November 10th, so Tuesday next week, under the ticker Cybin, CYBN. And so we're excited about that. But what these financial steps enable us to do is really progress our clinical programs. Our lead program is for major depressive disorder. We're developing a sublingual film version of psilocybin. We start the phase 2 study in January, and we expect that study to run for the entirety of 2021. So we'll read out around the end of 2021, which interestingly puts us kind of neck and neck with Compass, which is interesting. But in addition to that lead program, we have a few other things going on as well. We have a partnership with the Canadian Centre for Psychedelic Science. We're developing microdosing protocols with a view to try and develop a clinical study in conditions such as potentially ADD, OCD, anxiety, using far, far smaller doses, so non-hallucinogenic doses that are maybe a tenth of the dose, but still have some psychoactive effect. And it's challenging when you start to get down to those low doses, so we're trying to develop those protocols, and we're excited about that. We're also working on a path to a novel molecule program, a range of molecules that we hope will be the next generation of psychedelics. We think psilocybin is fantastic, has tremendous potential. But like I said, these are 6 to 8 hour, sessions that are quite traumatic. If we could create or adjust these molecules so that potentially we could have a product with a profile that is much shorter, so fast onset of action, maybe a much shorter duration, maybe 1 hour or so, with fewer side effects, maybe no hallucinogenic effects. Who knows? That's difficult to say. But we think that just makes these treatments much more broadly available. But as of today, we're also building a consumer mental wellness platform. It's coming together, and we expect it to contain a range of products and services and potentially devices, all aimed at addressing mental wellness, mental health for the consumer that is curious about protecting their mental space. Kind of a one-stop shop, if you like, for all those things, which we're excited to roll out within the next 6 months.
That's incredible. So exciting. I mean, I'm really stoked about what you guys are doing. A question that comes up for me with your background and with the work you guys are doing around, adjusting these profiles and trying to reduce side effects. I mean, it's really drug development, right? And so how different is psychedelic drug development from, I guess, traditional biopharma drug development, which you've, obviously spent a lot of time working on in your career?
We don't see it as any different at all. I mean, you have the barriers of psilocybin being a Schedule 1 product, which creates some challenges moving the material around to various locations for formulation or for testing or whatever. But those aren't insurmountable. I think what really works in our favor, though, is unlike novel drug discovery, a lot is known about these molecules. Thousands of papers have been written over the years, as you mentioned, from places like Johns Hopkins, NYU, Imperial College, that create a whole bedrock of data that we can rely on, which means that we should be able to get to market much faster. We're hoping to be among the first to market with psilocybin, probably not the US first. I mean, the US is certainly in our sights, but some markets outside the US, potentially in as little as 2 to 2.5 years from now.
Oh, that's incredible. What are your thoughts? I ask everyone this. No one knows the answer. It's impossible to know. But what are your thoughts on scheduling? When do you think that psilocybin will be off of Schedule 1?
Yeah, I really don't know that. And I think, what's encouraging is that the FDA has taken a really smart route here. I think what they've done is by granting breakthrough therapy status to 3 companies now, 4, I guess, if you count Spravato, they've basically said, hey, prove to me that these work. Let the science lead the way. And I think that's really smart of them, rather than get into a political battle around whether these drugs should be scheduled or not. They're basically saying, go develop them, create the evidence, show us they're safe and efficacious. And then it'd be pretty difficult, given the momentum, as we talked about, in places like Oregon and DC, and in places like Canada, where Health Canada has granted compassionate use access to psilocybin to 13 patients now. With all that momentum, and with FDA kind of supporting the creation of scientific data, safety and efficacy data, it'd be hard to see that these drugs not getting descheduled at some point in time.
You guys just raised a ton of money, obviously, the largest go public round. And I was curious, what was that like? Was it hard to raise money? And I'm asking that from a place of, like, we've done some rounds in this space, and it feels to me like there is just money burning holes in people's pockets to get into this space right now. Did you find it easy, or was it a challenge? How was that process?
I wouldn't call it easy. These things never are. And we got started in the summer, and it was a little slow in the summer. I think people were kind of, sick of the pandemic and away taking vacations. And good for them. Everyone deserves that. But once we crossed Labor Day, things really started to pick up. And, our focus was really on those US biotech funds, as I mentioned. And once we started to get some momentum, it really came together fairly quickly. We had a lot of demand. In fact, we were oversubscribed pretty significantly. Our original goal was 14 to 21 million Canadian. We took 45 million. And we were probably 5 times plus oversubscribed. So that's really encouraging. It means that there's interest and capital out there to bring these products to market.
And I'm seeing that in the space. So when we look at deals in the space, it's kind of interesting in a way, because there are deals where it feels like the companies are maybe struggling a little bit, but then there are deals the other deals are 5x oversubscribed. That 3 to 5x oversubscription is kind of normal in this space right now. So it's the good companies are, like you guys, are having their way right now with raising capital. And it reminds me a little bit of the cannabis space, of the marijuana industry when it started coming of age itself, which I think that industry ended up kind of burning a lot of investors. I think our industry here in psychedelics is a little bit different. Could you kind of draw that contrast? When you hear an investor say that, when you hear them say, I got burned in the cannabis space, how do I know this just isn't that all over again? If you get that question, how do you answer that question?
Yeah, that's interesting. We do hear that, and I think that people only get burned once. So anyone that was burned in the cannabis space is very cautious about the psychedelic space. But I think they're quite the opposite of each other. Cannabis had a lot of recreational use, but really quite challenging to develop cannabinoids into pharmaceuticals for a number of reasons. Often these cannabinoids work together in unison, and developing combination products is tough. And also they're oil soluble, which makes formulation a little challenging as well. I think with psychedelics, very different. You've got, as I mentioned, 40, 50 years of scientific data. These are drugs first and recreational second in many ways. Now, I know that the natural compounds have been used for a long time in ceremonies and various other things, but that all contributes to the efficacy data. So, look, I think like cannabis, though, one similarity is that we're seeing a lot of small companies starting up, and there's a lot of innovation. And the best innovation comes from small companies, in my view. What we'll see, I expect, is some consolidation as time goes by, as companies like Cybin and others that are raising capital have the firepower to kind of soak up some of that innovation and consolidate some of those molecules and innovative programs. And I think that's kind of fairly natural. So we're never getting away from other folks starting their businesses and focusing on innovation. But I think it's likely to see, as in most other industries, that you'll see some consolidation over time.
Yeah, I don't disagree. And I do think the space is very different. There's a lot of very important differences. And I think that the space, whether intentionally or accidentally, has done a good job of branding itself in the public eye as not so much recreational, but as a medical treatment for a disease, for numerous diseases. And I think that's, while cannabis certainly is used for medical treatment as well, cannabis kind of has a branding problem that I think that psychedelics certainly also has, but not nearly as intensely.
Yeah, I think you're right there. Yeah, I think that, but very different branding problems, aren't they? I think that the psychedelic branding problem comes from a lot of misinformation that was really politically driven, and it's good to see that the mindset changing and people being more open-minded to these therapies.
I see some early stage psychedelic drug development startups putting a picture of Richard Nixon in their deck and making a timeline about how it became illegal and why it became illegal and the politics behind it. And it's interesting, and the history here is really fascinating. There's been a lot of stigma around psychedelics, and one of my core thesis points for mental health broadly is where there is the most stigma, there's the most upside opportunity for investing. And I think that the unwinding of the stigma around psychedelics creates so much opportunity in this space. And I think that's probably where I think a lot of this demand, these oversubscriptions, is coming from, is that stigma's unwinding quickly, and it's creating a massive market.
It's creating a shift. That's right. And I think, that's where investment often goes, is when you see a rapid shift. So this isn't something that, as you say, that's going to take a decade to bring these things to market. These aren't early stage molecules. They're fairly well characterized molecules that are simply being held back from market by that stigma, right? And by the politics. And if you can quickly remove those barriers, which are not development and scientific barriers, they're man-made barriers, then you create a market shift, and investments are bound to flow in that direction.
Where do you think the white space is in psychedelics right now? Is it, if I'm an entrepreneur and I want to build in this space, should I be doing drug development? Should I be building infrastructure, pickaxes and shovels, SaaS services for providers? Or should I be building treatment center networks? Where are the opportunities to build in this space right now in your mind?
Yeah, well, all of the above. I think those are all good ideas. What I personally would like to see, I think if you ever had sort of a blank piece of paper, one thing I think that is missing is a really strong network of compassionate use programs or palliative care centers that are turning to psychedelics. Why not, right? If you've got people at the end of their lives suffering, really struggling with the depression and anxiety that comes along with that, I think there's enough safety data out there on these molecules for regulators to say this is okay, right? You've got a right to treat yourself with whatever you like within reason, and these molecules have been shown to be pretty safe enough at least for the use in those circumstances. So I would love to see an expansion of compassionate use and not have those folks have to wait for the drug development and regulatory timeline. Other than that, in terms of like blue sky, we had unlimited capital. I would love to skip forward to generation 3 or 4 of psychedelics, and leap past the psilocybins, which obviously we believe strongly in the potential for psilocybin, but it has its challenges, with the 4 to 6 hour treatment sessions. If we could leap forward and create a tablet that you took that worked in 10 to 20 minutes and didn't have massive trauma and side effects, and then led to long remission from depression or maybe a cure, that would be great, wouldn't it?
How long is that going to take?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that we expect to see sort of generation 2 start to get into the clinic probably by the second half of next year. Obviously, those are fairly early studies, proof of concept. So it's an iterative process. We know a lot about these molecules, and there's lots of ways to tweak and adjust them to improve their properties. So, but it's still probably, before you get to that utopia, is probably still a decade.
Yeah, I agree. One of the things I had Ronan Levy on from Field Trip, and he was saying that he thinks that the psychedelic industry will revolutionize psychiatry, and 20 years from now, we'll look back on how we treated people, how we treated psychiatric patients as barbaric, 2020 and before. How do you feel about that? I kind of agree with that. I think psychedelics will absolutely change psychiatry forever. How would you react to that statement?
I think that's true. Psychiatrists have had to rely on fairly subjective tools and also treatments that really just address the signs and symptoms. And now they have access to treatments that can be transformative. But I think that the field of psychiatry is also shifting as the country is shifting, as the world is shifting through this pandemic too. An increased awareness of mental illness, a reduced stigma around it, a willingness to talk about it. That's a huge leap forward in itself as well. You combine that with the availability of these treatments, and that's a real leap forward.
Some advice for me as an investor that I'd like to ask you about, or for other investors that are listening, there's no shortage of people out there raising $3 to $5 million to start developing their whatever compound or whatever solution they want to build in the psychedelic space. How do you separate the wheat from the chaff in this space? It seems like there's just everybody's raising money to build a psychedelic drug development platform right now. It can't all be great, right? By definition, there has to be an average. How do you determine as an investor which ones to pursue and which ones to stay away from?
Oh, well, you're a seasoned investor, Stephen. Yeah, you know the answer to this question. It's like in many other startup businesses. Number one, the team of people. Often, I would always invest in an A team with a B idea rather than a B team with an A idea. So the team, number one. And number two, in this space, it's got to be, unfortunately, intellectual property. And I know a lot of folks, that's a sensitive word, but drug development is extremely expensive. and it takes a lot of investment over time. And for investors to have confidence, they need to know that investment is protected with IP. So if you've got good, strong, novel IP, and you can add something to the patient's treatment regimen, and you've got a strong team to execute, then that's a pretty good bet.
So what next for you guys? I mean, you guys are going through the phase 2 starts in January. You'll be done with that by December of 2021. Once that's done, for our non-pharma listeners, after December of 2021 and the phase 2 is complete, what's the path from there to getting the sublingual film into the market?
Well, outside the US, we think we have a fairly abbreviated pathway based on some of our discussions with regulators in jurisdictions where there aren't the legal barriers to psilocybin. Inside the US, we expect that we'll have to run another pivotal study involving US sites, which would probably take another year. And then you've got a year after that for regulatory approval, most likely. So the US is a little bit further away, which is one of the reasons I would love to call for more compassionate use. In the meantime, as I say, we're building a mental wellness platform, trying to connect with consumers well ahead of that, and connecting consumers with resources to address their own healthy mind.
What are some of those geographies that will be where you guys will be able to go to market the soonest?
Well, we're running our study actually in Jamaica at the University of West Indies Hospital. Very phenomenal team there. Psilocybin was never criminalized there, so that's certainly one that we're looking at. And others include Brazil, Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, etc. There are about 14, 16 jurisdictions around the world where the legal barriers are a little lower, I should say.
Do you think people will travel to those jurisdictions to get these treatments, or do you think most people will wait for it to become legal in the U.S.? I know that's a very hypothetical question, but I'm just kind of curious if you think people will travel.
Yeah, I think some people are already traveling to get these. But these access in those places can be pretty expensive. Thousands and thousands of dollars, which for the average person is an awful lot of money. And that's one reason we think that going down the pharmaceutical route makes a lot of sense, because ultimately we expect to get reimbursement from governments and insurance companies, which will mean that everyone can have access to these treatments in the future.
Yeah, I agree with you. As we kind of get to the end of our time here, what am I forgetting to ask? Because I'm not a biopharma guy and I'm new to the industry. There's got to be something I can't even think to ask you. What would you ask yourself? That you think would be interesting to know about this space?
I would already start, if you're an investor, start thinking beyond the obvious molecules. When we look around at a lot of the molecules that are being focused on, like psilocybin, and we're fairly well advanced, getting into phase 2 shortly. But you see companies starting out with very early programs around the very well characterized molecules that have challenges with IP. I would say, if you're an investor or someone interested in this space, look beyond that to the next generation. You've really got to be thinking ahead, and there are opportunities there not just for novel treatments, but also improved treatments that are better than these. And I know that's kind of a weird thing to say when these molecules aren't even on the market yet. But if you're someone interested in this space, in some ways it's a little late to be thinking about investing in some of these earlier ones, some of these early programs that we're seeing small companies starting up, and think about innovation and how we can improve the patient experience in the future.
So outside of psilocybin, what are some of those molecules that are seemingly well invested in right now?
Oh, like LSD and MDMA, for example.
Got it. I agree with that. I do think there'll be a 2.0 very soon, and there'll be a 3.0. Tell me if I'm characterizing this wrong, but I feel like we as humans kind of stumbled upon psychedelics and having this mental health impact. So the first generation compounds that we're using they may not be the best ones. There might be much better compounds out there. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it's ironic, isn't it? We stumbled across them thousands of years ago, and they've been used for that long and treated with a lot of respect. And then through our politics, we really put a damper on innovation, which is a real shame. We could be much further ahead. But look, there are also an awful lot of naturally occurring psychedelic molecules for sure that have not yet been classified and identified. Plenty of species of mushrooms that have not been fully characterized. So I'm sure there are more naturally occurring molecules out there as well. But we, because of this sort of 40, 50 years or so of science that has been going on behind closed doors. We know quite a lot about the chemical nature and the chemical properties of these molecules. So I think we'll see innovation coming through fairly quickly.
Well, look, I appreciate you spending time with me and with our audience. I think this is really educational. I think this is really helpful for not only founders that are listening that want to build in the space, but also for the investors that are listening that are pouring into the space and want to know where to look and how to diligence some of the opportunities they see. So thank you, Doug, so much for spending time with us today. I really enjoyed this, and I really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me on, Stephen. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you again to Doug for being here today and for sharing with us. I think a lot of people will find these insights helpful. To our listeners, thank you for being here. And please, if you like our content, hook us up with a subscribe or a like or a review on your podcast platform of choice. And we'd love it if you'd share us with a friend. To the founders out there, don't forget to join the Mental Health Startup Slack community, which you can also find a link to in the show notes. And don't forget to check out the What If Fellowship program, designed to help you get from where you are with your mental health startup to where you need to be, whether that's scaling, fundraising, finding a co-founder, customer discovery, financial planning, or whatever it is that you need to do to take your business to the next level. Finally, we really want to hear from our listeners. Please do comment on social media and let us know what you liked or what you want to hear more of or what you disagreed with. You can reach out to us on Twitter at StigmaCast. You can find us on Instagram at Stigma Podcast. You can email us info@stigmapodcast.com. Thank you for being here. And until next time, stay safe, be well, and thank you for your support.